platform for interdisciplinary research collaboration amongst all faculties at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. He is Professor of Transnational Environmental Governance and Policy and specialises in the study of global environmental politics with a focus on climate change governance, biodiversity, forest, ocean governance, transnational relations, public-private partnerships, network theory, and institutional analysis. Some of you will remember Philipp from last year when he hosted last year's Common Ground International Conference on Environmental, Cultural, Economic and Sustainability, along with other colleagues at the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. And that was on the theme, accelerating the transition to sustainability. And Philipp, along with his colleague, Dr. Sjoerd Kluving, is editing a special issue on that theme of our journal on accelerating the transition to sustainability. And we've been working on that recently, and it promises to be a very interesting issue. He's co-authored, authored or edited 8 books and published 50 articles in peer-reviewed journals. His most recent book is The Anthropocene Debate in Political Science, which he co-edited with Thomas Hickman, Sabine Welland and Lena Parch. He's won several scholarships, grants and awards, including the 2009 Science Prize of the German Political Science Association. Philipp, welcome back, and thank you very much for agreeing to deliver this afternoon's plenary. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. It's really great to see you. I'm a bit envying you there in the sun in Granada, and my apologies that I didn't make it in person. I like to think, of course, that it's good in a way because I didn't need to take a plane, but still I would have really liked to be there. I want to extend my thanks for the invitation to Jose and all the organizers of the conference at the University of Granada, and also to my friends at Common Grounds, Philipp and Hampson. Really a pleasure to be back. You mentioned already, David, I was hosting together with my colleagues last year's conference. So I really like the format. I enjoy the broad debates we have, and I hope I can make a meaningful contribution, and also hope that at some point we can actually meet in person because it's still really appreciated. Okay, I will share my screen and show you a couple of slides and talk for about 30 minutes, and then hopefully have time for discussion and some interesting exchange. All right, let's see how that works. Good. You should be able to see my presentation now. All right. So just as a little disclaimer, I mean, probably like many other people invited for a keynote, I changed actually the title of my talk, but just slightly so. So the title is Transformative Change in Times of Global Uncertainty. And I want to really argue that we need not just a bit of change, cosmetic change, symbolic change, some greenwashing here and there in a nice brochure. We need deep, meaningful system change, what I like to call transformative change. And just starting off with the quote I really endorse by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN: making peace with nature is the defining task of the 21st century. And I couldn't agree more. The question, however, is how are we going to do that? How can we make peace with nature? How can we restore our relationship with the planet and actually ensure the survival of our species and of our civilization? Now, the answer is we need indeed transformative change. So in this presentation, I will argue a bit how we're going to do that, what are the important ingredients, and what are the important conditions for transformative change to actually happen. And I will look back at the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, to learn a couple of lessons from that. In the beginning, however, I will briefly depress you. And I know you're all initiated, you're all experts, so you're probably already very depressed about the state of the world, so I keep that very, very short. All right. So a couple of years ago, I think, if anyone would have used that acronym, VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, not many people probably could have related. But I think after 2 years of a global health crisis, we all know how that feels to live in a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and very ambiguous. And this is really the context in which we need to achieve radical transformations, which makes it ever more difficult. And that is why I think learning from our experiences in the COVID global pandemic is quite meaningful. And I will return to that idea later. All right, so let me jump right in and just reminding you, although I hope this doesn't need a lot of reminding, that we're not in some sort of hypothetical crisis. We are in a real crisis that's unfolding quicker than anyone thought, much broader than anyone predicted, everywhere around the globe, and actually in a way that is irreversible in the time scale of humans. That's already quite depressing, right? So adding to this, there are, of course, a number of potential futures for us. So we can choose, in other words. The worst case scenario would be, and I talk a lot about climate here today because it is, I think, one of the most important sustainability challenges, but it's not the only one by any means. And by the way, they're all connected. But climate is still very important because you can show a lot of things using that example. So we have different futures at our disposal, right? We could do nothing basically and end up at 5 degrees warming by the end of the century, which basically translates into the end of civilization as we know it. However, we also have a real opportunity, still a feasible chance to mitigate climate change at the level that would translate into something like 1.5 or maybe 2 degrees, something in between, which is the best we could do and is still feasible, although very, very difficult to achieve because it needs transformative, deep change. And just let me add one comment. And sometimes you hear someone say, by the end of this century, it sounds like really long time in the future. How I think about it, well, the end of the century, 2100, is when my potential grandchildren, I do not have grandchildren, but I do have children. So when my potential grandchildren might be around 60 years old, and they might want to think about where they go and enjoy their pension maybe. That's 2100. It's not that long into the future. Okay, so keep that in mind, that what we decide today will have an impact on your grandchildren and their children and mine. All right. Now, why are we so concerned about all of this? Well, there are a number of reasons. But one thing we should really be concerned about is basically this unpredictability that I mentioned in the beginning. So of course, we talk about global average warming. We talk about sea level rise. We talk about the increase of drought and flooding. But what is really problematic is that we are getting closer and closer to tipping points in the Earth system that are irreversible. We can't really predict where they are exactly, but we know they're there. And if they happen, then actually it's game over for humanity. And I will just give you one example. This is a study that was done a couple of years ago and has been actually reconfirmed recently about the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, or short AMOC. Most people refer to this as the Gulf Stream, which basically is a warm water pump that connects the Caribbean to Northern Europe and makes sure that we have relatively warmer climate here than our friends in Canada. Studies have shown that this has already weakened by some 30%, and it might actually approach a tipping point within this century. So within the lifetime of my children and their grandchildren. And if that happens, then it's not only a regional problem because it will disrupt weather patterns, seasonal patterns, rainfall, and so on in Europe, but it might be actually a really problematic global event. Because what could happen is that oxygen-rich water and oxygen-less rich water will not mix anymore, so any organic matter will decompose anaerobically and release further greenhouse gases, in particular methane, but potentially also hydrogen sulfide, which is actually a toxic gas. And the last time that happened was 250 million years ago, at the boundary of the Permian and the Triassic period. And it was the biggest mass extinction event in the history of the planet. And that just shows us that we're not just talking about some small scale disruptions, we're talking really about system change in the Earth system. So what I want to say is, if that is correct, and all the scientists say that it's correct, then we need to answer with system change in the social and economic system as well. We cannot just tinker around and maybe hope that some technology in the future will all help us. That will not going to happen. So we are in crisis and our political institutions are not delivering. We are not really moving on international agreements on biodiversity, as you might know, on the sustainable development goals of the UN. We're not making progress. Neither do we make progress really on climate change. Although the latest COP26 in Glasgow wasn't a disaster per se, but it just barely kept the 1.5 degree target alive. And if you still are not really worried or in panic mode, as you should be, then maybe let me quote someone that you might believe more than you believe me. This is the filmmaker David Attenborough, and he's not known to be a Marxist, right? But he still said that we need to curb access capitalism to save nature. So when someone like he's worried like this, then we have a problem. All right. So let's talk about what we need to do. And it is, in a sense, very, very complex and very, very simple at the same time. So what we need to do is we need to stop doing what we do right away. The earlier, the better. And we need to drastically do this very, very quickly. These are potential emission scenarios for 1.5 degree landing in 2100. The difference between those is just the certainty we have that we will stay within that boundary. But if you compare those, they all look quite the same. They are very, very steep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. In 2050, basically, there will be no emissions. Sometimes we say net zero, which is a magic word for saying, hopefully we will figure out something. But basically it means mid-century, we can't have any greenhouse gas emissions. So not really a lot. We can have very few. So then that means, how do we do that? And this is a sort of a technical problem, you might say, but it's of course much more than that. It is a question of our normative thinking, of our moral thinking, of our legal practice. It's a question of economics, of how we live together, how we organize politics. It's a question of everything. So everything needs to change. So you might say, well, that's not possible, right? It's very, very difficult. But there's a lot of scholarship that shows that change is the norm, right? Change is always happening. So we can learn from change. That's the good news. We have a lot of insights into how change actually occurs. So this is often referred to as socioeconomic transitions. So when you look at this illustration, about you're the ball and I'm the ball. Our economic political system is the red ball and we're in this current state. It's a fossil fuel, extractive, expansionist regime that doesn't really care about people and nature. And many, many people agree that we need to push the ball into a new equilibrium, a more sustainable state, right? And the question is, how do we do that? Now, some of my colleagues have published an article last year, now it is already 2 years ago, time flies, in 2020, where they said, we need contagious, fast-spreading processes of social and technological change within the next couple of years to make this happen. And actually, I think they published this article right before the corona crisis hit, because they use these words, which are today a bit problematic maybe, but they have a point. We need contagious and fast-spreading change. We can't really wait another 2 or 3 decades. We need to change within basically this decade. And what is important here is that we need both technological change, but we also need social change, change in the way we organize society. All right. So let me briefly talk a little bit about this idea of socioeconomic transitions. Usually they're understood as a transition between a technical system and the surrounding norms and social practices, like taking a cab in Amsterdam or London in the late 19th century. If you were affluent enough, you would have taken this carriage here to this, which is the first modern automobile. And if you just look closely enough, you will realize it's just a carriage without the horse. And in fact, we put the horse inside. So that's why we still call the power that drives the car horsepower, right? So at face value, you would say this is not a big transition, right? But with many transitions, there is much more to it than meets the eye. And this is very, very important to realize. So in order to actually be able to build a modern automobile, you have totally different skills than people who would build a wooden carriage. You also don't need to sustain horses in a city. I read somewhere that at the end of the 19th century, there were around 20,000 horses in London, for example, because that was the main way of transportation. Today, we have gas stations all around cities, right? So we need infrastructure for the fuel, for example. We need to build roads in a certain way that accommodate the tires made of rubber. So that's why there's asphalt all around us. So actually, we change a lot of things. Actually, we change everything to accommodate those technologies. Right? We need to train engineers. We need to educate them at universities. So we have to have professors that know how to build cars and so on and so on and so on. So one little transition translates into many, many different changes in both economics, in social practices, but also in politics. And that is good news, actually, because you can think about a number of key transformations that will push the system into a more sustainable direction. However, the reality often is that those transitions don't go as quick as we like. They don't go as linear as we like, and sometimes they don't work at all. And this is very, very frustrating. So let me just show you one example. And I use something that I see a lot when I look out of my window here in Amsterdam. Maybe some of you have been here. Many people use bicycles, but some people use these modern, very small electric vehicles. And they're super cool, very fancy, right? And they're nice because they're not as big as a big car, right? They don't need as much space and they're electric. It's cool. And then the second thing I see when I look out of the window, it's right below actually my window, car sharing schemes. So everyone is sharing their car, right? And there's commercial schemes out there like this one. There's actually a parking space right in front of my window, one of those. But many others also privately share. So when you put those things together, we think of this electric mobility and social change into a sharing economy as a big innovation. And we think of that as a real transition. And that's actually true. However, when I tell you that already in 1976, so that's, that's almost 50 years ago, by the way, we already had an electric car sharing scheme in Amsterdam. And this here is called the white car. Then you see that sometimes an innovation can really fail, okay? So transitions are not linear things. They can go off course, and this is really problematic. We can't really plan them very well, which means that we cannot just sit idle and think that everything will work out only because we have good ideas and some technologies. No, we need to put them together and make sure that the right conditions are in place so that this could have happened much, much quicker. All right. Now, let me go into what we can actually do. Because you might have noticed that I'm not super depressed. I'm actually quite optimistic about that we can reach a 1.5 degree target at the end of the century. Because I know that all the things we need are there. All the knowledge is there. So what is that, what we need to do in the language of transitions? Now, actually, it's quite simple if you think about it. And probably most of you will work on one of these, do research on these, have heard about this. So this is not controversial, right? So the first transition is a transition from a fossil-based energy system into a renewable one that is mainly electric. So we need electrification and we need a massive increase in renewables. Of course, we need some bridging technologies here and there. Think about green hydrogen, for example. And there are interesting policy debates in the EU right now, whether natural gas and nuclear could be such bridging technologies, but give and take, we know what to do. We need to electrify our energy system and make it renewable at the same time with a number of adjunct technologies. That cannot be that difficult, right? That is actually straightforward. And of course, it is much more difficult as it sounds, but it is a clear goal. The second thing we need to do is we need to rethink how we use space. And I don't mean outer space, I mean the space available on Earth. Because what we do is we waste it. We have a very expansionist spatial regime, which is basically saying that we just build another shopping mall somewhere, more houses, doesn't matter, more roads, and we just encroach on the last remaining areas of wilderness, which is problematic. So what we need to do is we need to somehow change that and go into a regime in which we would keep some parts of the planet for itself. Now you can debate how much that is in percentages. I know that the late biologist E.O. Wilson, he had this book which was called Half Earth. So he said basically half of the planet should be left alone. And we can have a debate if that's correct and if it's maybe 40% or 35%. But the fact that we need to get away from an expansionist regime in terms of spatial use is very uncontroversial. Also because actually in most scenarios to reach the 1.5 degree scenario, someone will tell you we need to plant trees. And the question is where? Because we also have more people, we want to eat more stuff, produce more things, enjoy more holidays. So there is a certain problem here. Also, this transition is uncontroversial in the scientific literature. Now, the third one is very closely related. We need to change the way we produce energy for ourselves, and that is food. The total greenhouse gas emissions from our food system, including the supply chain, is estimated to be between 30 and 40%. That's a lot. In addition to that, our food system is producing a lot of side effects, unwanted side effects. One is it makes people sick. As you know, the biggest cumulative health problem is not COVID, but obesity. And there's still people who do not have enough calories on a daily basis. So our food system is not delivering on that. And at the same time, it is very, very wasteful. So it is estimated that only in the United States of America alone, last year we killed 55 billion sentient beings. Just 1 year, 55 billion animals slaughtered for human consumption. This is very, very wasteful. So we need to change that. All right. So we need to transition the way we produce energy, the way we use space, and the way we feed ourselves. All right. Let me try to say the same thing again, but a bit differently, because it didn't register sufficiently. What did I just talk about? Well, I basically tried to convince you that we need to stop doing something that's really wrong. And German sociologist Harald Welzer just published a great book, which is about our inefficiency and basically incapability of stopping with stuff. We're not good in stopping with things. We want to continue, we want to grow, we want to get better at stuff. We rarely say, I quit. But we need to quit these three things that do not work. So we need to quit fossil fuel extraction, right? We need to stop with an expansionist spatial regime of building ever more infrastructure around the globe, encroaching even into the most remote areas, right? Cruise ships in Antarctica and so on and so on. And we need to stop also with a wasteful food system. And this is the child-friendly picture I chose, right? The reality looks really different. Now, when you just imagine you would show anyone those pictures and say, actually, this is the way we organize our world on a daily basis. That's how we do things. People would say, are you nuts? This can't be the best you can come up with. You really need to stop. And I think actually stopping with smoking is a good example because these are addictions. These things are not necessary. It's not necessary that we organize the world in this way. It's just something we do and we got accustomed to it. So we have difficulties accepting that we need to stop. It's like with any addiction, right? It's very, very difficult to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, of meat, and of an expansionist spatial regime. But it is necessary, because I told you what will happen if we don't. We basically jeopardize the existence of human civilization. That's very simple. So the question is it worth to continue those three things? And I would say no. Okay. Now, one thing left to say. If we want transformative change, then we need to make sure it actually happens. And I want to quote Secretary General Antonio Guterres again. We cannot go back, he says, to the old normal, and that is pre-COVID, to inequality, injustice, and domination of the earth. We need to step forward into a more sustainable, equitable path. The doors open, the solutions are there. And I just outlined the three transitions we need to go through quickly. But still, there is a question, what is actually necessary for this to happen? So I want to tell you the three conditions under which we can actually succeed. And I mentioned already that I think COVID, pandemic, can teach us some lessons on this. So which are these three conditions for transformative change? The first condition is that we start quickly to build a narrative that would connect the ultimate goals and the steps in between in a way that is open for different worldviews, different perspectives. So what do I mean? I mean, we need to combine the scientific storyline of Earth system tipping points with a different storyline, maybe that of Mother Earth. And we need to do that because actually we don't have a clue how we want to live in 2050. People say, yeah, net zero. But what does that mean? Just think about it. Does it mean we will live in healthy urban cities where people are equitable, they have access to education, and we live together in maybe communities of practice that are small scale and localized? Or do we live in some sort of top-down global state that will surveil us all to make sure that we don't pollute? Very different scenarios. And we never discuss them, but both are very possible, actually, right? So we need to discuss not just zero emissions or mitigating climate change or 1.5 degree. We need to discuss what type of world do we want? And we have to do this in an integrative way, in a deliberative process, and that is how it works. So we better get started with that. And I'm not saying no one ever discusses this, but if you look at the media, it is still too much about temperature, concentrations, emissions, and these scenarios that I showed you in the beginning. It's not about the quality of life that we want to have. Now, this is the first important transformation, the first important condition for transformative change, because without that, without a narrative that brings us together, there's no chance that we will agree, and there's no chance that we get anywhere. Now, the second thing I want to mention is really inspired by something we've seen in the COVID pandemic. And that is that we listen a lot to the few people who disagree, and they get a lot of attention. They get so much attention that now we talk about that societies are splitting. That's not true. There's just a couple of people that really disagree with something. That's fine. It's okay. But maybe they shouldn't get the attention they get. In other words, there is a majority of reason. There are many people who actually got a vaccine 3 or 4 times and that social distance and they wear a face mask. Actually, that is the vast majority of people. And again, the vast majority of people on this planet actually believe climate change is real and that immediate action needs to be taken. If you don't believe me, the European Union just polled its citizens. The outcome is really interesting. 90% of European people believe climate change is real. It's the biggest problem there is. And 90% agree with the EU regulation on it. Good. This is the majority of reason. It is there. It's just not that visible. We still listen a lot to those that try to derail the process, usually for very selfish reasons. So what we need to learn is, let's support this majority of reason. If we don't do that, then we will end up in a situation where further and further we split up into our own little kingdoms of truth. and we will never arrive at a narrative. The third condition is pretty simple and pretty difficult at the same time. Transformative change needs the realization that actually what we talk about is solidarity and justice. And again, you can look at the pandemic. It will not be over until every country has access to the vaccine, the majority of the population is vaccinated, and the healthcare systems can operate normally. Then the pandemic is overcome. We're far from that. Actually, vaccination rates in Africa on average 10%. Why? Because global solidarity is lacking. And the same is true in climate change and in environmental sustainability in general. We still talk a lot about what we want to do and how good we are, for example, in the European Union, but we still do not deliver. And that needs to change. The realization that there is no transformation without social justice. Okay, where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with a final question. Okay, where are we? Are we close to that tipping point of social change into a more sustainable future, or are we still far away? Look, I'm an optimist. I think we're very close, actually. We're not there yet. We still need some pushing. We still need to put in intellectual work. That's why we have this conference, political work, private work. We have to push the ball, but it is close to a real societal tipping point. There's a lot of data that shows that many actors really start to believe in that the future is sustainable. Now, if you don't believe me, that's fine. So I will quote someone else, hopefully not Antonio Guterres this time, to end my talk and say, I really strongly believe we are close to this tipping point because the times, they are changing. Thank you very much.